Welcome to this Dart Centre Asia Pacific webinar on supporting freelancer safety in the digital realm, which is generously sponsored by Google News Initiative. I'm Erin Smith, the CEO of the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma here in Asia Pacific, and it's my absolute privilege to host this webinar today. And we certainly have an incredible lineup of panellists from right across Asia Pacific for you today, who bring together an absolute wealth of expertise and lived experience. So for the next hour, we're going to hear from each of our speakers discussing a range of topics related to supporting freelance journalist safety in the digital realm. And each of our presenters have been given 2 specific questions that they're going to address, and they'll each speak to those questions for 5 minutes each. In the middle of our webinar, we're going to share with you all some poll questions, and we'll guide you through those as we get to that point of the webinar. And finally, we've allowed some time at the end of our session for some Q&A. So can I please ask you all, as you're joining our webinar, to just take a few moments to have a look at the chat function and introduce yourself, letting us know who you are and where you're from. It will just be lovely to see how much of Asia Pacific we have represented here in today's webinar. And that's also where you can use the chat function or the Q&A function to post any questions that you might have for our panellists throughout the webinar, and we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can at the end of the session. Now, I've asked all of our expert panellists to come together today without PowerPoints, in a very conversational and informal tone, to talk to some topics that they are really passionate about. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker for today's webinar. Now, project lead at Dart Centre Asia Pacific, Amantha Perera has been a correspondent based in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and is currently based in Melbourne, Australia, where he is studying online harassment and trauma as part of his PhD studies. He covers Sri Lanka and the Asia Pacific region with a special interest in conflict, post-conflict situations, humanitarian disasters, and climate change. And the first question, Amantha, that I'd like you to have to discuss with our participants today is, given your personal lived experience throughout your career in dealing with online trauma, what safety and security considerations do you think freelance journalists should be aware of when they're working in the digital realm?
Thank you, Erin, and it's great to be here. I think the most important in terms of assessing online threats, be it freelance or otherwise, is to consider it as reporting in a hazardous environment, that you're walking into an environment which is going to be full of threats, and then kind of like work yourself to plan out what those threats are and analyzing those threats. So in a sense, what we would need is a threat matrix. And to kind of break it down, is first would be to identify what kind of a threat we would be facing. So each of us would not be facing the same threat. We would not be facing the same threat in the same platform. The platform, the threats, the composition of the threat, it's going to differ from person to person, from platform to platform, and sometimes during the time in which you are going to access these platforms. And then to look at what triggered this, or what is triggering these threats. Then going another step further to look at what is the source. Now that's quite important, because as we would see that the source of the threat could be human, it could be machine generated, and it could be a combination of both. And that's really important, because when you try to mitigate these threats, it's really important that we have a clear idea what the source of this threat is. And then also it's important to figure out the kind of hardware we are looking, or we are kind of being exposed to this threat. This is something that we don't really look at that often, but it really makes a difference where we are mostly exposed, in terms like whether are we stationary, is it on a desktop, or are we getting these threats on our mobile devices? And if we're getting it on our mobile devices, are we getting these threats wherever we are, whatever we are doing, and not kind of trying to make sure that we are in control of the exposure levels. And even if it's a stationary machine, where is it? Given how our workspace, given how our work environment has changed in the last 2 to 2.5 years, it's important to figure out, where are we being exposed? Are we being exposed in a home environment, in an office environment? What kind of environment is that? Because that becomes very important in terms of like the impact that this is going to have. It's a different impact if you are going to be exposed to a threat that is coming to you in terms of your work, if you are in a work environment. But if you are in a home environment, it's going to be a little different. And I think also to look at the location of the threat in terms of like origin. Where is this threat coming from? Can we identify where the threat is originating from? Because this is important, because if you can clearly figure out where the threats are originating from, it also gives us a certain handle in terms of like the possibility of the threat migrating from online to offline. And this is happening quite often now, and we need to kind of be aware of all these things. So I guess what I'm trying to say is to identify the threat composition, the characteristics of the threat that we are facing as freelancers. And it's important that we start doing this as freelancers, because most of the time we work alone and we don't have the kind of organizational structure and the colleagues that would come and give us the kind of advice that would be needed to keep a tab on these things constantly. So we need to be a little bit more proactive in terms of assessing these things on our own. And it's probably like looking at digital triage in terms of like assessing the threat. So you first identify the threat, then you look at intervention. And I think possibly the most probably a neglected aspect of it is, where does the closure come in? Because simply identifying a threat and then going through the process and just going through, like, when we identified, we're mitigating it. It's not enough, because for us to kind of, move ahead professionally with our work, we need to have a certain level of closure. And if we can't have that level of closure, we need to assess why we can't do that. And finally, what I would want to add is that to start these interventions small, because if each one of us goes back and look at our digital and social media footprint profile, it's huge. Journalists tend to have wide, varied digital media profiles and footprints. Now, if you are trying to suddenly address the whole gamut of it, I don't think that's going to be possible. I think what's really important would be to start small and then trying to address small bite-sized incidents or sections and then widening this. Finally, it's like this is not going to be over. These threats are going to be dynamic, and we're going to be exposed more and more, and the dangers are going to be probably more dynamic. And it's not only a self-care issue. At the end of the day, this is also an issue about freedom of expression. If we don't feel safe online, I don't think we can do our job professionally. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Amantha. And I think that's really useful advice, because I know for any of us who have experienced threats within the digital realm, sometimes that can feel very overwhelming and we're not quite sure what to do about it. So I do like your advice to start small, finding ways that you can actually take some control over this instead of trying to tackle the whole problem straight away. And I do like that phrase that you use, digital triaging. So thank you, Amantha. Our next speaker is Arzu Geybulla. Now, Arzu is an Azerbaijani columnist and writer who focuses on digital authoritarianism and its implications for human rights and press freedom. In 2014, Arzu was featured on BBC's 100 Women Changemakers, and in 2019, she launched Azerbaijan Internet Watch to document and monitor information controls in Azerbaijan. Arzu, you've previously come under threat for what you have written. So I'm wondering if you can share with our participants today what advice you have for when it comes to assessing at what point a threat escalates from common criticism or feedback to a situation of actual serious concern.
Thank you, Erin, for having me today. You know, I was actually thinking when I first heard this question, and I think the sort of the overall umbrella of what I could say is it really depends on your experience. So that assessment depends on your experience with harassment, with online harassment. If you are just coming into this and you have no idea that what you're actually experiencing is online harassment, then the assessment will, of course, change. At least this is how I've experienced it. So when I had my first, I guess, introduction to online harassment, this was 2014. I had no idea what was going on was actually online harassment. I didn't even know what online harassment was to begin with, to be honest with you, at that point. And I do remember that at first, you know, I just thought these people were just, you know, writing these comments that were actually not even criticism. They were borderline sort of harassment, but also slash, you know, leaving comments that were damaging to my reputation, to my journalism, and whatnot. But again, because I didn't know that what was going on was indeed harassment, I didn't really know how to assess the situation properly. So I think that's a very important advice, or sort of something that I could share based on my experience in terms of assessment and understanding that. And of course, then there are red flags. I had people leave comments that range from, you know, accusing me of being an agent or working for the enemy, or making a lot of money for the things that I was writing. But then there were comments that were actually sexually abusive. You know, people were posting things and sort of sending me messages that were talking about the ways that they wanted to abuse and hurt me, like physically hurt me, and like in a very descriptive language. And then, of course, there were death threats. And I think that sort of, I guess the language and the words that you see in the threats that you get, you understand, of course, that wait a second, this is no longer about me being an agent. This is no longer me about making money. This is actually a very disturbing comment and comments that just keep coming and coming. And that's when I think when you see that shift in the language, and when you see that when it actually also becomes very, very, very personal, including, you know, targeting your family members and whatnot, I think that's when you also realize that this isn't just someone, you know, being upset about what I wrote. This is something far worse than that. And I think finally, again, kind of going back to this experience point that I was making earlier on, as sadly as it may sound, as you continue experiencing online harassment, you kind of develop your own internal assessment mechanism. And then immediately when you see a tweet or a comment or an email, you're like, oh yeah, I'm reporting this right away. I'm not going to like, you know, even spend time trying to mitigate on a personal level and speak with the person who's targeting me. So I'll leave it there, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Arzu. It's always fascinating to hear from those who've experienced quite intense online harassment, such as yourself, and the ways that you have managed to start assessing, you know, what is actually, just common criticism, some feedback that I just need to deal with, compared to what's something that we actually need to take notice of and report. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and advice on that. Our next speaker is Gemma Mendoza, and Gemma is Rappler's head for digital services and concurrently lead researcher for disinformation and platforms. And in this capacity, she leads Rappler's multi-pronged efforts to address disinformation in digital media, harnessing big data supported research, fact checking and civic engagement. Now, Gemma, given your experience and the research that you have been undertaking with Rappler, what advice do you have for our participants today when it comes to designing some strategies that we could use to respond to misinformation and digital attacks?
Hi, yeah. So the first thing actually that I was very much interested in what Arzu said. Like she mentioned something about like, is it normal? Is it the usual feedback, or is it something else? And actually that's the first thing that we did at Rappler when we were when we were subjected to a huge to tremendous attacks online. So the first thing is really like looking at assessing the attacks, like what exactly is this? What is the nature of these attacks? Is this the normal feedback that you would get, or is this something else? Is it and more often than not lately, it is something else. I mean, like the reality of life now for journalists is that the people we have been covering before who have been, of course, to begin with, challenging already even before, they have kind of like scaled up in their in the way they react to stories from journalists or coverages from journalists that they don't like. And that has been something that we have seen over the past years. And in this regard, so it's very important. One thing that we have really found very important is the documentation. Like when you are under attack, finding out finding like sanity usually requires documentation. And in our case, we started like initially with screenshots, like looking at like making sense of what's happening on the ground. Rappler's always been involved, I mean, like closely monitoring feedback on the ground. We have a whole team, a social media team that does regular monitoring of how people are reacting to our stories. But through the when the attack started, it became something that we did systematically to a certain degree. And I know that this is not something that might be available for freelancers, but to a certain degree, the data gathering skills that we've had before, the big data skills that we've had before, which we used for other for reporting, for data journalism, was something that came to our rescue when we were attacked. Because sometimes when you're talking about relentless attacks, sometimes it's no longer enough to just copy and paste things or screenshot things, because we in order to detect patterns, it's all, I mean, big data gathering sometimes is necessary. So that's one of the things that we saw. The data gathering is critical both for determining what next to do. Like is this something that we can raise to the platforms? Is this something that can be addressed from a legal standpoint? Is there, what action can we do? It's very important to consider that when you're under attack, the attacks can be in various forms. So they're definitely important to look at the different exposures, as Amantha said. The digital footprint, you need to be very conscious of your digital footprint and what that means in terms of vulnerabilities. What happened to Rappler was not just attacks on harassment online, but also other forms of attack. And then finally, it's very important actually to look at who can support you. And I think this is very important for freelancers. In the case of Rappler, it's very difficult actually because already, but for freelancers, I would imagine it's harder, and therefore very important to find support.
Thank you, Gemma. There are a couple of things that really stood out for me with what you were saying there, and given my own experiences as well, is that how important it is to document when we receive these kind of digital threats. And I know it was something I overlooked and just didn't do, but I am much better at doing it these days. And as you said, there are a whole range of ways that we can do that. And also being mindful of our digital footprint. I really like that. So that's something that we can all do is, and I know this is something that Arzu has spoken about previously as well in some work that she has done about being mindful of where we're the most vulnerable as well. So that's really, really important advice. So thank you so much. Our next speaker is Nicole White. Nick is the ABC Australia's social media wellbeing advisor. It's a fascinating and important role and one of its first of its kind established to support the digital safety of the organisation's journalists. And I've had the absolute pleasure of working alongside Nicole when we've been providing some peer support training to ABC journalists. And one of the things that she spoke about within that training that really stood out for me is a question I'm going to pose to her today, because I think it's just so important for us to all consider. So Nicole, why is it so important for us to understand context when it comes to assessing digital threats?
Thanks, Erin. I guess, unfortunately, it's really hard to stop online abuse. We have cases where we've taken people to court, or we can issue cease and desist that can detract a single individual, but that's just one person. And until such time as law enforcement issue strict penalties that are relatively consistent manner, we're going to continue to see online abuse from others. So we can obviously take steps to reduce exposure through muting and blocking and changing our notifications. But I do think one of our most effective means of managing the emotional impact, and particularly in regards to our self-esteem with work, is context. So online abuse feels super personal, and often what I see is so steeped in racism, misogyny, and homophobia. And it's an attempt to silence diverse or female voices. Research by the wonderful Dr. Passetti at UNESCO shows that 73% of female journalists have experienced online abuse. And that goes up to 86% if you're an Indigenous female journalist, or 88% if you're an LGBTQIA plus female journalist. And interesting, you look at women who work in traditionally male-dominated areas like sports reporting are more likely to be targeted as well. And while that's incredibly depressing, it can also be empowering, again, from that self-esteem about your work perspective. So not so much looking at, say, the death threats and that sort of thing, but when we're looking at, that barrage of pylons and criticism, is to really understand that before you've even put out content, you may be at a higher risk, can be really, really useful. And it's, again, the silencing mechanism, and that's not only voices in a conversation, it's also commonly linked to shutting down reporting of certain topics. And this can be done by governments in some countries. It can be used by groups that you are reporting on, or people with a common interest. So, for example, late last year, 65% of what crossed my desk at the ABC was from reporters covering COVID. And so it's a really clear and coordinated attempt to stop reporting on that content. Reporters have their phone numbers shared quite frequently in Facebook groups with a script for how to abuse them. And unfortunately, it's really successful, this silencing. One study found that 38% of journalists self-censor, and 38% also retreat from visibility, and 20% left social media following online abuse. So it's a really powerful tool to silence conversation. I was listening to a podcast the other day from one of our reporters who had assisted after he was targeted with death threats by a community that he was reporting on. And he released an updated report on the issue. And I was honestly just so blown away at how brave that is. And I'm not sure that everyone can continue in the face of that. And I think the people that do this know that. And it's not only sending that journalist off the trail because, you know, you're saying, well, if you keep following this story, this is how you're going to be targeted. But it's also a signal to any other journalist who wants to report on that as well. So just understanding the context, I think, is really important.
Thanks, Nick. I think there's so many really important and useful reminders in there for us about contextualizing why these people might be making the threats that they are. And I recall one piece of information you shared when we were doing some training together, and that was about, you know, the high percentage of threats that actually come from bots compared to humans. And so sometimes I think that's really helpful to be mindful when, you know, I always get asked questions in trainings, well, when is it appropriate to respond and engage and go back? And it's like, well, if you realize that maybe 80 or 85% of these threats are from computer generated bots, they're not even humans, that sometimes that helps us, you know, avoid that urge to fire back. Thank you for our speakers for addressing those first round of questions. We're now going to break things up a little bit with a series of poll questions. So Lisa, our fabulous EA, if I can ask you to share our first poll question with the group. So this first one is, I have experienced online threats or harassment. And so you've got a couple of choices here. So I've experienced online threats or harassment, never, occasionally, or frequently. So if you can all just take a few moments to give your answer and we'll show the results. So I've experienced online threats or harassment, never, occasionally, or frequently. Okay, hopefully everyone's had a go at choosing their response. So what did we find for that answer, Lise? There we go. So, so there are some of us that have never experienced online threats or harassment. So that's great. But yeah, most of us have occasionally experienced, and but yeah, some of us do experience them more frequently. Next question, please, Lisa. Okay, I have experienced, oops, that might have been, yes, that's okay. Have we got the next? Okay. There we go. I feel prepared for the risks that I encounter within the digital realm. So do you feel not at all prepared, somewhat prepared, or very prepared? So this is about your preparedness for dealing with those risks that we encounter as freelance journalists in the digital realm. So not at all prepared, somewhat prepared, or very prepared. And what results do we have for this one, Lisa? Okay, so yeah, quite a few of us are not feeling very prepared. So some of us are somewhat prepared, and probably the minority of us are feeling very prepared. So we still have some work to do to better prepare ourselves for these risks that we're going to encounter and continue to encounter. Next question, please, Lisa. So I feel confident in knowing how to respond to online threats and harassment. So I don't feel confident in knowing how to respond. I feel somewhat confident, or I do feel confident in knowing how to respond to online threats and harassment. So how confident are we feeling? What results do we have here, Lisa? Okay, so some of us aren't feeling very confident at all. 5 of us are feeling somewhat confident, and at least one of us is feeling really confident. So that's good to know that someone out there is feeling really confident in knowing how to respond. That's great. Next question, please. So this is interesting. We were really keen to find out from all of you which online platform you feel most vulnerable on. And this goes back to Amantha's discussion around understanding where our threats are coming from, and with Gemma talking about our digital footprint. So which platform do we feel most vulnerable on? Is it Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, or maybe something else? And if it is another platform we don't have listed here, maybe you can jot it down in the chat for us. But what did we find out for this one, Lisa? Where are we all feeling the most vulnerable when it comes to digital threats? Twitter. Okay, so it's quite clear. Facebook, and then someone else has listed other. So hopefully we can get whoever had that other platform listed, that they might be able to share that with us in the chat. Okay, next one. I actively engage in digital self-care activities to build my resilience. So we all know how important self-care is, but sometimes we're probably better at talking about it and not really as good as practicing as what we preach. So when it comes to self-care, how often are you engaging in that? Is it never, occasionally, or frequently? How often are we making time to engage in self-care? And what do we find out with this one, Lisa? Well, this is pretty good. Unfortunately, there are some of us who struggle to find the time to not engage in self-care. So that is concerning. Most of us probably are finding some kind of time occasionally to engage in digital self-care. And it's great to see that someone there is engaging in self-care frequently. So, but still a little bit of work to do, I think, in making time for ourselves to engage in self-care.
Telegram.
Okay.
Telegram was the other platform that
Telegram. Okay, fantastic. Have we got any more questions, Lisa? Oh, there we go. Do I regularly talk to somebody when I've experienced online threats or harassment? So this is really us trying to figure out how actively you are all engaging in, some kind of discussion and talking to somebody about what you have experienced. So is it never? You never talk to anybody about what you're experiencing? Occasionally or frequently? Okay, and what do we have? Okay, so that's concerning that there are some of us who just don't talk to anybody, because I think this is one of the most important things we can do, is feeling that sense of connection and talking it through. It could be with a colleague, with a peer, it could be with a friend or a family member, it could be with a professional mental health provider as well, but it is really important for us to talk about what we are experiencing it, right up there probably with the importance of documenting it. Okay, well, thank you for sharing your thoughts on those questions. Okay, sorry, we've got another one here. When I do talk to somebody about online threats or harassment, who is it most likely going to be that you're going to reach out to? Would it be a friend? Would it be a family member? Maybe a colleague or somebody else? And again, once again, if you tick that other box, maybe you'd be happy to share in the chat function with us who that other person is that you're comfortable talking to when you're experiencing online threats. So what were our answers for this one? Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so most of us are talking to friends, some of us are talking to family members and colleagues. So I think all of those are really important sources of advice and support for us after we have experienced online threats. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on those topics. We're going to now, given time, jump straight into our second round of questions. So Amantha, I'm going to come back to you, and just let me pull up my questions here. So Amantha, I know that you are very passionate about what we call social media self-defense. And so I'd really love it if you could take some time now to share with our participants, given your lived experience, what has worked for you when it comes to protecting yourself in the digital realm? So what are some of the practical things that you do as part of social media self-defense to look after yourself?
Yeah, so I think all of us spoke about something that is really important, which is context of usage and context of how we are exposed to these threats. And in terms of freelancers, and I used to be a freelancer in Sri Lanka for over the decade, we tend to work in isolation. And in terms of the digital threat, we tend to kind of feel as if like we are getting these threats exposed in isolation. And it can actually feel as if like you're in a 24/7 cosmic firestorm, that these things are coming at you at a rate through a screen without any lessening of the rate. And I think what has really worked for me is to kind of walking into this sphere prepared. I used to cover the war in Sri Lanka. And when we used to go into the conflict area, there was one thing that we used to carry, and we never forgot that. That was the flak jacket. And now every time I turn on my computer, I kind of virtually wear a digital flak jacket, that I'm prepared for this, that I'm walking into a minefield or something even more dangerous. And I go prepared for that. And that's what that really worked for me. So understanding that these threats are out there and that these threats can be mitigated if I'm well prepared. And in short, one of the things that has kind of worked for me is how I create boundaries. So what the last 2.5 years has done to me, and I guess to a lot of my journalism colleagues, is that our work has shifted online tremendously. Maybe before COVID, I would say that my offline work was complemented by what I do online. Now it's the other way around. My online work complements what I do offline. So my online resources are the most important for me in my line of work. And because of that, I have created boundaries. So one simple thing is that I tend to kind of slow down towards the weekend. And there are days and weeks where I do not access my work profiles at all during weekends, because it's really hard when you start, because we come from this background where you're 24/7, we are news driven. If a story breaks, we need to be there. You have to kind of train yourself. It's like training yourself for a marathon or the decathlon or something like that. And I've kind of like been able to do that you shut them down and you keep them there and you go back to them on like Monday or whenever your work week starts. And the other thing that has happened is like all my social media, all my digital work is now related to my work. Because what I realized is that I cannot handle when my personal and my professional collided. That if I were to get a threat and I knew that photographs or details of my loved ones were on that same social media feed, I would get really nervous, anxious that, they would get dragged into this. It may not be really big. It may not be like, something that would turn physical or offline. It could be as simple as using a wild remark. Like we said, there are all these like really despicable vitriol that comes out. So because of that, I have gradually kind of taken my personal self out of my digital profiles. It's not very fun. You don't go viral very easy, but I can tell you that you feel more safe, and also you feel a little bit more assured that you're not going to put your loved ones and those you're closest to in danger and in harm's way.
Thank you so much, Amantha. I was taking down a couple of notes as you were talking, and I've underlined a digital flak jacket. I love that, because as you said, if we were going into a physical threat, we would be physically prepared to go into that. So we know we are facing an ever increasing threat within the digital realm. So having a digital flak jacket, and as you said, really identifying and understanding the importance of boundaries. And I really like that clear differentiation you're now making between your personal life and your digital use and your personal life compared to your professional life. And you and I have had lots of discussions about how important it is, as you said, to take that personal part out of our professional online profile so that we can reduce some of those really personalized attacks that come through. Thank you so much for that. Arzu, back to you. We know that we are dealing with a really rapidly changing threat landscape when it comes to the kind of abuse and threats that you might be exposed to as freelance journalists. Given that, why do you think it is so important for us to map our vulnerability across different digital platforms? And how do you go about doing that yourself?
Of course. I guess I also learned that the hard way. In terms of understanding where I'm vulnerable and why I should know where I'm vulnerable the most. I have multiple social media accounts. I use Twitter mostly for work. Instagram is just for personal story sharing and travel photographs, yoga pictures, and things like that. And Facebook is mostly used for staying in touch with people, but also looking for ideas for stories, because this is where a lot of the discussion that happens in Azerbaijan takes place in Azerbaijan. And so understanding, first of all, where I am presently as a journalist, but also as Arzu, was something that I had to learn in the process that I was also learning what online harassment was based on my experience. And I realized that once you know the way you respond to harassment changes, and the way you start looking for allies changes. I'll give you a very sort of basic example. I never really thought that I would get targeted on Instagram, for instance, because it was very personal. It had nothing to do with my work. But actually, it was the opposite. This was 2020 war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. 2 years ago, I was covering the war. And I was working with an international outlet, but I was also writing my own sort of opinion pieces. I was doing interviews on the situation in the country. And there was one specific interview that I did that kind of triggered this very unpleasant wave of harassment about my views of the conflict. And I remember I went to bed. I woke up in the morning, I opened my Instagram, and I had like 1,000 requests, message requests. And that happened because I actually locked my Instagram account the night before, or maybe a few days before, because I was already anticipating people's response. So that was kind of helpful to change that setting to protect my own mind, peace of mind, but also know that, I guess this is where they can come after me because they can use my pictures, which is something that they did anyway. I was a little too late to lock my Instagram account at the time. They did end up using some of my personal photographs and using it against me and whatnot. And so, again, it really, mapping that out, knowing where you are most vulnerable and how that can be used against you can help you to respond to that kind of harassment. I think it also changes your modus operandi as a journalist, right? There are moments in our careers, in our work, when there is at least a little bit of space between you jump into this crisis situation that you have to report, and that moment, that time sort of gives you enough space to understand what you need to lock, what you need to take offline, what you need to keep online for the work and for the stories that you're doing. But then often we don't really have that room to, change all of that, or make those necessary arrangements to understand, oh, I'm vulnerable here, I do this and that. And so I think the best advice, or at least something that I've started practicing more and more often, is knowing ahead of time what my modus operandi is. I know that, very quickly I can take measures. I can, take my Instagram, deactivate my Instagram, lock my Twitter account and whatnot. So knowing where you are, but then also knowing how vulnerable you are on the platforms that you are really helps you to respond and deal and document the harassment that you're facing.
Thanks, Arzu. Some great advice there. And I think since the very first time I heard you talking about that, I've become very aware of really understanding, where I'm most vulnerable and what kind of threats and what kind of abuse you might get on different platforms. And as you said, just being aware of that allows us to be better prepared in how we might respond to that. So thank you for sharing that. Gemma, we know you've been doing a huge amount of really important research with Rappler, and I'm wondering if you can share with our participants what that research is telling you about the kind of online attacks that journalists are experiencing.
Yeah, sure. So since the past, since 2016, actually, we've been really looking at the data on the online harassment, not just of Rappler, but other journalists in the Philippines. And one of the things that we've really seen is that it's true that like on one hand, at the personal level, the attacks can be really personal, as Arzu has pointed out. Anything and any possible opening can be used to attack you, and in many occasions, some of the attacks that we have seen are like violative of the privacy. It involves many times families involved. It's very misogynistic. The language can be really, really terrible. and but beyond that, what one of the things that we noticed with the past in the past years is the scale of the attacks and how the whole thing has evolved. So essentially what's been happening is that you have the people we cover, they really evolved into there's really been an evolution of like uh this apparatus online that's been used systematically against journalists. So we're talking here of an almost separate in information delivery apparatus, like a network that's delivering content online that's favoring like powers that be. So in the case of the Philippines, the online trolls in the Philippines, you have that already, like and it's very much entrenched. And knowing that is very important in terms of response. The other thing that we've seen is that while it is directed at individual journalists and very relentless against like those who are particularly in the focus of like but at the same time, it's also not just about the individual journalists, but it's about the media as a profession. So what we and it's a lot of it is not really directed at the journalist himself or herself, but also to the general public, the audience of the journalist. So it's reputation. It's a big part of the research that the online harassment we found was meant to not just silence the journalist, but also attack the reputation of the journalist so that the public will not believe what we're writing. And that is that's an underlying theme that we've seen in many of the content that we've seen the disinformation that we've seen online. So it's designed to, so essentially what's very important here to highlight is that this is not something that while yes, there are interventions at the personal level on the part of an individual journalist, but it's very important to really look at this as something that you cannot address yourself, and you have to then look for allies, as Arzu has pointed out. It's very important to have not just a support system, but a community that will support you. Because when you are when you are at the receiving end of these attacks, most likely, like when I said documentation is important, it's likely that you are not going to be in the position to do that documentation because because you are the one facing the attack. So when that happens, there will have to be a support system. You will need that support system that will help you out and push back and not just push back, but also support, document what's happening and for further action. So, yeah.
Thanks, Gemma. Something that I just noted down as you were talking was, because it comes back to what you said previously about the importance of documentation. But as you just said, then sometimes when we're right in the middle of the threat and the crisis, it can sometimes be a bit difficult for ourselves to document that. So just what you've highlighted there, how important it is to have that support network around us, and even reaching out to somebody to say, hey, can you help me document this at the moment is a really great tip. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, Nick, over to you. Many of the participants present today will be facing challenging and threatening situations when they're working in the digital realm. Given your experience as the social media wellbeing advisor at ABC Australia, what do you think freelance journalists can do to be better digitally prepared to deal with the online abuse? And what can they do if they do experience online abuse?
Yeah, I think so much of this has been spoken to in terms of thinking about this before it happens. I do think that's one of the most useful things we can have is, as Amantha said, knowing what's online about us. And as Arzu said, thinking about the ways that we can be contacted and what our social media settings are across platforms can really help to reduce that anxiety, because you know, okay, cool, my Twitter's going nuts, but my Instagram's locked down, so people can't contact me over there, which is really important. When you're doing that assessment, taking a look at, I think when you're pitching content or commissioning content, having a risk assessment that looks at, you know, what are the content sort of content pieces that we know are more likely to elicit this response. And there's always going to be outliers that you don't expect from, but there are certain topics in the Australian context, for example, reporting on human rights or sexuality or the far right are all things that we know really increase the risk. So thinking about what topics may increase that risk and talking to each other as freelancers, you know, thinking about what has elicited that response previously for you, but, you know, having other groups that you speak to and saying, you know, what has brought out that response for you, and being able to prepare in that way. And also, of course, thinking about yourself as a journalist and what your risk assessment is, just based on what I was saying earlier. And then once we have that risk assessment, thinking about proactively how we can reduce exposure. So if we know we're working on a really high risk piece of content, maybe you want to change your Twitter settings for the following days to only be notified, say, for activity for people you follow, so that you reduce a lot of exposure. You can also think about, you know, maybe I want to have a public profile on Instagram, but I don't want everyone to be able to DM me. I only want people I follow to be able to do that. So really leaning into those platform built mechanisms to be able to support you. And there is eSafety Australia, for example, has guidelines for each of the platforms. So if you're obviously not working for an organization that can provide them for you, you can reach out there. The International Women's Media Foundation also have a lot of practical tips to prepare for online abuse too, so you can lean on those resources. I think we really need to, particularly when this happens, speak up and break the silence. As freelancers, it's particularly hard because you obviously don't have an ongoing relationship with media you may not always feel safe to, but if you do feel safe to, I think it's really important that media organizations know. For us at the ABC, we have resources to support our external contributors, but also even talent who are featured in our content. So if someone's featured in an article by us, and because of that, they receive online abuse, we have guidelines to support them to prepare for that and to respond. Now, obviously, every organization isn't going to have that. Not every organization has someone in my role as a social media wellbeing advisor, but I think we can start the conversation and see what resources are available to support, so that when this happens, you can know what's there for you as well. The other supports to think about is just the Coalition Against Online Violence. If you haven't heard of that, they have a number of resources for what to do if you experience online abuse as well. And there's some international organisations that can say help with relocation. The Rory Peck Trust does that. So there are things out there for freelancers that you can lean on. I'd say just make a document and list them, because it can be so overwhelming when you experience this. So just have them written down, so if you do need them, you can jump in and have them there.
Thanks, Nick. Some really great advice there. Well, we're coming towards the end of the session, and I think we've had some great insight, and we're so grateful for all of our panelists today sharing their thoughts and reflections and lived experience. So we do have some time for some questions. So if anyone does have some questions that they would like to put to any of our panelists, please jump into the Q&A and put them there. One has come through from Sarah. And Sarah's asking, why is it that a freelancer gets singled out when they are threatened online over the contents of their writing or program content? The institution that publishes or airs the content are quick to say that they have no responsibility over the content produced by the freelancer. So how can freelancers be able to find that sense of security within the broader media sector? So I'll put that out to all of our panelists for any thoughts or replies to Sarah.
I mean, I can take that question unless Nicole wants to.
Yeah, go for it.
I think it's not so much being singled out, because I've been a freelancer for most of my career as a journalist. It's more about the relationship that you have with the platform you're freelancing for and the editor. At least, in again, like speaking from personal experience, I don't want to generalize. It was my sort of ongoing relationship with the editors that I've worked with over the years that actually was what helped me deal with the harassment in many ways. Their support, their sort of openness, and their willingness to address the harassment that I was getting in form of, limiting comments, or getting back to me and actually telling me that we received this many emails with people criticizing the story that you sent us about this or that. So that was what really helped in my case. And I think it's important to develop that relationship. I know that's really hard, because as freelancers, we end up actually writing for so many different platforms, and we keep searching for new mediums where we can get published. But I also think that, maybe it's almost a safer game if you have an ongoing relationship with a few editors of platforms that you work with.
Thanks.
I don't know if this was helpful, but
yeah, no, I think that's really great advice. And Sarah, I hope that's helped answer your question. Gemma, I've got a question for you. And I think one of the things I've taken away from today's session is that sometimes the intent behind some of these threats that we deal with is really to silence what we're saying, to silence our message, to take away our voice, and to silence these conversations. And I think we would all agree that if we lost even one voice, that's one too many. We need to have all of our freelance voices out there. So my question to you is, you touched on this idea of support and a community of support. What do you think we can do to build that community of support for freelance journalists?
So I know that in the Philippines, there are at least a couple of organizations that have been working. Like, for instance, we have the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines. They've been supportive of the members when they are under harassment. And then as well, there's also an organization, the FOCAP, which is attending to the foreign correspondents. But essentially, being part of a network is really critical, I think, in these days, particularly because of the nature, the evolved nature of the harassment of journalists. It's not just about one story anymore, and it's not just about that that individual that you're talking to. Like, it's really because the attacks can come from all over and in various ways, and then and it can be relentless, that you need to be part of a community that will support you. And if you're not yet part of that, yes, I agree with Arzu, like being part of like having that relationships with editors is important for freelancers. I'm not a freelancer myself, but I could imagine that the nature of the attacks that we faced in the past years as Rappler, if that is faced by somebody who is alone, that would have been worse. And therefore, there really is a need to work with others.
Thank you, Gemma. There's a question in the chat, and I might actually throw this your way, Nicole. It's from Trina McClellan, and she's asking what you recommend journalists can tell, or how they can prepare their talent in regards to managing their own social media risk.
Yeah, I think thinking about the ways that you can, and it's sort of similar, so maybe not to the same extent, but preparing talent for the fact that they are going to be exposed to a larger audience by nature of engaging. And so, think about what you want your social media settings to be. Maybe for the few days after publication, you might like to turn your profiles on private. I always recommend that people don't read the comments on news websites, because I certainly don't. They can be awful. Even though we have moderation, we still have guidelines that we have to work within. So just ways to reduce their exposure and boost their resilience, and just having some preparedness for them. And I think as journalists, I wrote an article earlier this year about the way that online abuse impacts democracy. And I spoke to some female politicians, and I knew that by talking to me, their risk was going to go up. And so I felt really comfortable in giving them some preparation documents that we have internally. And it was so well received. And it made me feel like, okay, I'm looking after my sources as well, which I think is another side of this that impacts our well-being, is being like, you don't want to feel as like, cool, I got my story, but I've in the meantime expose someone to this. So yeah, if you can just give them a little bit of preparedness, it's a bit helpful both ways really, and better relationships with communities ongoing as well.
Thanks, Nick. I think that's great advice. One final question before we wrap up, and I'll throw this your way, Amantha. Lucy would like to know if you know of any kind of step-by-step or technical or practical guides or recommendations that might be out there that we can follow to enact some of these recommendations that we've been talking about today. So are you aware of any kind of useful tip sheets or recommendations or guidelines that you could highlight for our participants, Amantha?
Yeah, in terms of like best practices for digital safety and social media, I think there's a few that are out there, and like institutes like the Point Institute and other journalism organizations do have it, but they are mainly like to say like safe social media usage or safe digital usage. But I think like in terms of like a step-by-step technical guide as to like how to implement this, I haven't come across something that is substantial, but that's probably because this is a threat and a danger that is changing by the day. And it also depends with each person. Now, that's one of the difficulties. There is no one size fits all for this one. And you can take the guides, but I think like it's really important that you analyze your social media footprint or your digital footprint, and then kind of bring in those guidelines to apply to them and to figure out where your exposure is. But guidelines, tip sheets, they are there. But what I would recommend is like, before like going into the tip sheets and guidelines, just kind of take a step back, look at your own social media profile, look at like where the threats are coming, look at what impacts you. Now, one example that I can give is that it really depends with what impacts you badly. I have been called a traitor for so long because of my coverage of the war. Those kind of, remarks really doesn't impact me now, because I know that, they're just thrown about. But there are others that impact me much more acutely than those. So it's really important that we look at the threats in terms of who we are and what we do. It's a little bit complicated, but it can be achieved. And that's the complexity of this. Each one of us is a digital media personality on our own. And there's no one like us anywhere else on digital space. So that's the difficulty, but that's also why we are so much attracted to this.
Thank you so much, Amantha. And everybody, Lisa has just put the link to the resource guide that is available through Dart Centre in the chat box there. I'm aware we're out of time, so I would like to end things here by thanking, on behalf of Dart Centre Asia Pacific and all of our participants, our fantastic speakers today, Amantha, Arzu, Nicole and Gemma. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your insight and your lived experience with us all. I think the past hour has been incredibly insightful for all of us. Before you leave, we would just like to let you all know that we will be following up with everybody that registered for this webinar via email to share with you a short evaluation survey. It will only take a few moments, and it would be most appreciated if you would fill that out for us. But more importantly, we will be sharing with you some links to some additional online training that we will be providing through Dart Centre Asia Pacific for free for any freelance journalist across Asia Pacific. Now, we will be running 90-minute training sessions on both the 21st of November and the 28th of November, and they'll be the same session run twice. So you can pick and choose which date and time zone works best for you. But all of that information will be available in the email that comes out to all of you after this webinar. But we would just like to emphasize they are free to join, those 90-minute training sessions that are also very generously sponsored by Google News Initiative. However, they will be capped. Numbers will be limited for those online training courses. So please get in quickly if you would like to take part in these great opportunities to hear from some additional speakers around digital safety and trauma. Please be sure to register to join us on one of those days. So finally, thank you all once again for joining us, and we hope you've taken as much out of the session as we hoped you would all take away. Thank you so much for your time.